I'm here, and my name is Luangkesorn. I'm a lead data scientist at Highmark Health. Highmark Health is an integrated um, health care company. So we cover both what we call payers, which is the insurance side, and providers, which is the hospital side. My background is in operations research, so simulation optimization, mathematical modeling, and my role as a data scientist. Uh, has been a lot of machine learning, predictive analytics, but in the past 3 years, I've had a number of projects with generative AI. Um, so when ChatGPT came out in late 2022, many of us were given the charge, tried on many things, figure out where it fails, figure out where it works, and come up with lessons for the rest of the company. And so I've had a number of projects with a range of customers. So I've worked with writers, people in strategy, finance, partner relationships are outside. And then I also have a volunteer role as a planner with the American Red Cross, and we're starting to use um, try generative AI in some projects there. And this talk is in lead is part of the lead up to the Informs Analytics Plus conference that's going to be National Harbor, Maryland in April. And this conference is going to be geared for analyst professionals. All the speakers and workshops are done by people who have extensive practice experience. So if you're familiar with the other Informs conference, the one in the fall is probably a little bit more academic. This one is very heavy on practice. People who have done real projects. They're going to be a mix of technical and soft skills tracks. This particular workshop will be occurring on Tuesday, April 14th. And unlike today, this is going to be geared more towards our business partners and leadership. So the participants do not have to be modelers or programmers themselves. And we're going to be using everything inside of a notebook LM, but it could also work with Gemini Gems called Project ChatGPT. So it's meant to the conference version of this is meant to be hands-on. And in the URL is down here, um, so you can look at it. So you can come to this later. Okay. So for the overview for this talk, I want to start with looking at generative AI as an analytics aid. So most of the time when you've been seeing people talking about generative AI as far as computer programming, they're often aimed at software engineers or and so this is going to be looking specifically at analytics. I'm going to give one example, which will go through all the stages of the Informs Analytics workflow framework using a health insurance example. This is actually a public data set, not a Highmark one. Next, I'll look at some what I call fault lines, things that generative AI does very badly in. And so if you're going to use a generative AI application, these are things you should be looking out for. And so this is something I talk to with my business partners on all of our generative AI projects. And then I'll kind of walk through practices for using generative AI in analytics. And I'll go through an example that Informs Practice did in the Advent OR, which was a little project that we did in December, where we went through kind of a full project um, that goes throughout the entire Informs Analytics framework. So first, what we're doing here, again, this is generative AI as an analytics aid. And so defining generative AI, models intended to generate text, images, music, or other data, including code, from patterns learned during training. And the models are trained on text, essentially the entire public internet. We've used it in there are a number of common applications. Again, you've been following the press. We're looking at chatbots, content creation, image generation, music composition, computer programming, and we like to see how it works in the realm of analytics. When we look at generative AI or anything, actually what we kind of find out, it has effectively like a year of experience in many, many domains. And again, this is due to the fact that it's been trained on the public internet. And the public internet is geared towards what we would call relative novices. What is useful if you're in analytics, all the skills that are outside your specialty. So things that you don't have a lot of experience in, particular programming with data, which is a skill set and that's not often taught in university settings. Different programming environments. I use several at my work and I bounce between them. And so it helps when I'm going from one environment to another. Using new different tools, libraries, and methods. And so most of us, again, have to use many different methodologies, many different techniques for different domains, different business partners or customers. And so as you switch from from setting to setting, generative AI, again, since it has that year experience in almost anything, is can help you make that transition and when you're starting new projects. Another thing this does very well is translation. So for yourself, it's interpreting information from unfamiliar knowledge domains. So this would be your customer, your business partner, their domain, because you are entering their world. You need to learn how to speak their language. And so when they tell you something, when they give you a problem statement, uh, you need to interpret from there into a language that you yourself understand if you're not from that domain yourself. And then when you're also, you as a technical expert, you have your own lingo, you have your own language, things that you're concerned about. You want to be able to write, the generative AI can help you write for your audience, whoever it may be. Again, your subject matter experts and your business partners. So they understand what you're saying and understand the implications. Another nice thing is it's an always available, you can think of it as an always available colleague. There are many, many domains that make the claim that collaboration leads to better outcomes. So for computer programmers, we talk about pair programming. And for us, analytics, the idea of working with another analyst or having a close relationship with your business partners. Um, in real life, this is often inconvenient. And so generative AI can always be an always available colleague where you can bounce ideas off of, or as you work your way through problems. So this is what we like to be able to use generative AI for. The way it works, again, you have training process. Your foundation models are built on vast amounts of data. Originally, this was all the data on the publicly available internet, and as the major providers are have exhausted that, they're all having strategies on how to find additional information, whether it's licensing data or using traditional print books and scanning them in. The generation will take a prompt, which is what you give it, and it takes your prompt, the words in your prompt, breaks it down into what I call tokens, and looks for those tokens in its training data. And from its training data and those tokens, it finds what other tokens are there and use it to try to complete and create a response. And so it is that last step is actually random selection. Now, if it happens, and so this is going to have some implications where we run into. And then part of the training is some certain amount of refinement. It somewhat learns how you react. So if you give it feedback, it will use your feedback. Um, and you can also have an interactive a session where you tell it how to improve. So some implications, again, since it's random selection and it's most likely response, it will be able to create a response. Okay. Now, the quality is going to depend on what is publicly available and published. And so this is kind of important. The majority of material on the public internet, for example, are based on relative novices, so beginners up to maybe 1 or 2 years experience. And so many of the topics are at a novice level. And if you want to do better than a novice, you're going to have to do something provided with materials, or you're going to have to do work yourself. So at Highmark, we have someone encapsulate this into what we call a persona. And then this is what we tell our business partners as we develop generative AI applications. And we like to say that generative AI is like an overeager, naive, new graduate hire. Now, starting from the end, because this is how the English language works, um, we talk about it as a new hire because it actually knows nothing about us, our company. It doesn't know how our company is structured. It doesn't know our values. It's a new graduate. It knows lots of facts, but it's naive. It doesn't know the implications of those facts. And so the way we kind of explain it to our business partners is with experience, you learn that if a particular situation is here now, here is present now, in the future, this is what's going to happen. And this is not something that's often written down. And so the generative AI doesn't know it and cannot extend facts to implications very well. And it's overeager. Again, it always gives an answer. And it doesn't always uh, have quality control in that answer unless you work with it. So I'm going to go through an example. Again, this is a publicly available data set, and I'm going to take this example and walk through the Informs Analytic framework to show how generative AI can be useful in every stage of the framework. So this is a data set called the RAN Health Insurance Experiment. Um, the data here happens to be readily available for those who use Python and stats models. This is one of the example data sets. It's well described. There are publicly available publications with a narrative background because the Rand Corporation, full disclosure, I used to work at Rand. But the Rand Corporation has research briefs which were intended for a public audience, and so it's well described that way. And there is actually good metadata. Um, the goal here is show how you would work with a specific client who needs specific insights based on a data analysis that needs to take a specific action. And we're going to say that it's a regional Department of Health exploring developing a self-insurance program for our region. So in the Informs Analytics framework, the first domain or stage is what we call business empowerment framing. It says it wants to understand what the analyst needs to know what problem needs to be solved in order to support the activities of the business. Okay, so this is different than what they might tell you. And so this might make it hard because often as analysts, our business partners or customers will often present a problem as a request for a product. They want a model, they want a dashboard. Okay, but this is actually usually not very useful. And so because what they really should be asking for, presenting is a problem that needs to be solved or alternatively, a question that needs to be answered, which will lead to a decision. And the reason that we talk about this way is there is a danger here, and that is a failure of imagination. And this failure is on both sides. The business partner, if they don't have an analytics background, they don't know what kind of answers analytics can give. And then for the analyst, they don't know, we don't always know what is the range of possibility that our business partners have. So we don't know what the range of possible decisions can be made. All right. So one thing we can use a generative AI for is we can look at the background and suggest topics for an initial meeting. In other words, so you don't go into a first meeting with a client or a business partner with empty-handed. You have ideas to spark conversation. So for this one, I would give a prompt. I would give a persona, meaning who the generative AI is supposed to be, an analyst. I will tell the generative AI what resources we have and some background. And I will ask for some potential topics of study or analysis. And I will ask the generative AI to come up with some idea on how potential results will be used. Now, when you give it this way, again, in this case, I said three. Normally, I would probably do more than that, but that's what fits on my slide. It usually tries to give you options that span some by diversity. Okay, so here are three possibilities. Again, each one talks about what it has, who a potential desired outcome might be, and what kind of what kind of action might follow this. Now, we're not expecting the generative AI to be omniscient and know what the customer wants, but the goal here is to provide a talking point for your a business partner when you have that conversation. Okay. And again, what we're trying to combat here is a failure of imagination on the part of the business partner and the analyst. The next domain or stage of the analytics framework is analytical problem framing. So if you have a desired outcome, uh, now you can suggest analytics course of actions. Okay, so I have a prompt and said this is the data set, here's my metadata, and I have a goal. Um, I want to know the relationship between outpatient visits and the other variables that was collected. All right, so we're giving context to the generative AI. And it can give an analytics plan. Now, this happens to be a problem that is amenable to statistical analysis, right? But in general, we have a little warning here again because the generative AI is trained on the public internet. And as far as analytics is concerned, the public internet has a high preponderance of statistics and machine learning examples. So it has a habit of suggesting statistics or machine learning. And we'll kind of talk about a little bit about how to bend it so that it has it considers other things. All right. It gives both potential techniques we can use and also warns of potential pitfalls. So it's giving a little bit, it gives some warnings here about, for example, the possibility of nonlinear relationships, which would make linear regression type analysis not work very well. The next domain is working with the data itself. All right. So in, and again, this is working with your organizational data stack. If you're not familiar with stack, you think about the entire information technology infrastructure that an organization has. So this can be things like a database server, application servers. If you have interfaces that are web-based, that kind of web servers. And so whatever data you have, you need to read in the data. You have to identify potential issues and clean it. There's some commentated tasks. And once you've figured out methods of analysis and libraries that you want to use or tools that you want to use, you need to convert your data into the form that you need. So generative AI is very useful for here. In particular, again, every organization has their own data stack. There are some standard architectures of layers, and there happens to be options for every single layer. Your organization ID department usually has picked one, and so the generative AI can help you use it. In my case, I actually work with three different data stacks, depending on my customer. My organization's IT department has dedicated teams on each stack, and clearly I, as someone who has to bounce between them, will never get as proficient as a full-time person. And so the generative AI helps me in the transition as as I work with my various business partners and the data stacks they use. Whereas, again, most of my IT colleagues are dedicated into one. So this helps me keep up. And next, after you have your data, it's ingested, we'll have methodology framing. Again, we're looking at methods of analysis. Now we're getting a lot more specific. We're looking at regression analysis, and it will give you suggestions as, uh, for example, what kind of model, with in this case within the realm of regression analysis, and what are factors and considerations that you're going to have to worry about as you go along. And then you can ask for alternatives at this point as well. If we say that we're going to use linear regression, we can ask the generative AI to implement a linear regression model. In this case, I was doing this all inside of Visual Studio Code and working with Python and the stats models. And so it will actually, given that stats models and statistics is fairly standard, it actually knows how to implement this model in stats models. And then you will get an output. Again, I'm using this for me. I'm using this inside of Visual Studio Code, so I actually feed this directly back into the generative AI for interpretation later. If you're using something that's not quite as common as linear regression or machine learning, you probably want to give it examples, and we'll talk about trying to find references or methods later. Once you've run analysis, you can use generative AI to interpret analytics output. When working with generative AI, one of the techniques that we have is trying to use structured work through a structure. You can structure your prompting or you structure the way you ask the questions, and you give it the structure for how you want the answer. And that generally improves the quality of the generative AI responses. Because analytics output, like statistics and linear regression, is a very standard format, the generative AI treats this as a structured input, and it will systematically go through the entire table. Uh, and so it starts out by going through every statistic and explaining them. Again, it knows the meta. We've already given the data dictionary, so it translates everything into English, into in English language. And one very useful feature here is it actually goes through all the model diagnostics. Um, I used to be a professor. This is something that people who are non-statistical experts often forget to do, is check the diagnostics. It will check the all the assumptions. And in this case, it identified the fact that the data is shown not to fit the assumptions of linear regression models. Okay, so it identifies the violations of assumptions and suggests alternative methods. So it's going to suggest a Poisson regression or a negative binomial. And again, people uh, who are not expert in statistics may not know what these are. And so it's helpful that the generative AI is able to implement these model in code. Okay, so a Poisson regression using the general linear models sec part of SAS models. We'll embed it, you get an output, and we can do the same thing for a negative binomial. So now we have a problem. We see an error that there is no negative binomial p function. Okay, and so this is part of the call here. Now, it turns out that in the realm of discrete regressions, there are two branches of stats models that handle them. There is your general model branch, and there's also a branch of stats models called discrete, which is usually used by econometricians. They both have negative binomial, uh, and they're both right in the sense that if you picked either path, it would work. But generative AI, the last step in its creation response is a random selection. And so without any other information, the the generative AI will pick between the two. That will be okay, except on a random basis when I run this, it's a little different every time. it will randomly try to switch between the two, and that's where it fails. For example, in this particular run. And so now in real life, the way you would handle this is your subject matter experts, once they realize that this was an issue, they would they would find those two branches of stats models, and they will create a standard that we will use this branch. Or uh, in this particular case, they would essentially say, are we econometricians or not? If you're an econometrician, you use the discrete branch of stats models. If you're not, you would use the general model branch. Okay, so, but you would create a standard and you would write documentation that the standard, and you would give the generative AI that documentation as well as everyone else. It would be part of your onboarding process. Okay, so this is a specific kind of failure. Again, there's the the commonly used word is hallucinations, but this is a very specific type, and I find it is helpful. Again, at Highmark, we were kind of taught that we were trying to identify kinds of failures so that we can teach it to the rest of the company. This kind of failure is a conflation because AI works by identifying training tokens in training materials. When you have uh, concepts or tokens that appear together or are very similar to each other, it will the generative AI is going to randomly choose from the training data. In the past, they have hoped, the generative AI companies and theorists have been hoping that uh, massive amounts of data will allow correct answers to overcome incorrect answers. This particular type of problem will never be solved through volume of data because um, econometricians want to do things their way for good reasons. Everybody else does it their way for good reasons. And so both of these solutions will always be present in the training data. And you'll always have this issue about choosing randomly between them. And again, the way you're going to we'll talk about this later, but you will create standards in the end. And you will tell generative AI what the standard is. Okay, so we'll go along. I'm going to go ahead and correct the function call. And so in this case, the function negative binomial exists without the p. So we'll go through that, and it now runs successfully. We can evaluate the models. In this case, we have two models out there. We can ask generative AI to compare them. Again, the statisticians have very standard ways of doing this. There are standard statistics uh, that we'll use. And so the generative AI will recognizes this from the training material and will walk through the relevant statistics for comparing models. And it will pick one in this case. In this case, it tells you to choose that the negative binomial is the more appropriate model for this. And it gives a reason. Okay. So again, big lesson here for the model development. It can be partner. If it's given documentation, it can interpret model diagnostics and output. This was a regression example. There's a lot of documentation on how to interpret statistics models available. In my projects, again, if it's more specific than that, I will ask our subject matter experts and business partners to write interpretation guides, so that when the generative AI makes its output, or model output, an analytical model output, it will then go to an interpretation guide that will give our end user an interpretation that they understand. And then we recognize that the generative AI does make mistakes. Again, I'm going to talk about fault lines, categories of mistakes in the future. And then one of the things that we can do to make it a lot better is to provide references. And we'll talk about that later as well. Deployment. So deployment is providing results to the people who need it in the form they can use to inform and improve decision making. And so in an organization, this can be um, feeding it into a dashboard that end users use. It could be giving it, say, inside a form of a notebook, what are the generative AI people call notebooks, or um, inside of an application, or it could be taking the output of the analytics and having an agent feed it into some other platform, okay, that the end users get access to. And so this idea of you have to transform your data from the form that your analytics software creates into a form that can be then distributed to the end users and interpreted um, are things that the generative AI can do. Um, for an deployment, one useful thing here is model interpretation. So what you want is summary-specific audiences. Again, most of the people here are analysts themselves, so we're used to looking for a very technical answer, so for example, a statistically sound answer. Um, we can then go from there to, say, a domain expert. Okay, so your domain subject matter experts. Again, you're still looking for a technical discussion, but you want it to be in the language of the domain. We can go, we can look at other types of um, stakeholders. So people are policy analysts, so they may not be experts in this domain, but they are analysts on behalf of the decision maker. There's the decision maker themselves, okay, and then the general public. Okay, so I've done this type of exercise. I did this once at a math department, and the we had a graduate student um, use their PhD dissertation to feed it into for this exercise. And again, when they were asked to create a public summary, the comment on the of the PhD students was that it chose something that was, yes, it was in their dissertation. It might not have been what they would have talked about. I had a friend there who was a professor of communications who was sitting in on that. Her comment was she wouldn't use the generative AI output as it was, but now that she saw it, she could actually ask intelligent questions. And that's probably how we would use almost all of these summaries from generative AI interpretations. Uh, you might not use it, but it's a really good starting point um, to work with as these particular stakeholders go on to their next stage of the decision making process. Some other observations here. Again, we talk about prompting. We're talking about personas, both on the persona of the generative AI as well as the persona of their audience. We see that generative AI is more neutral if you tell it that you have a technical audience. Generative AI has a reputation to being very optimistic and sycophantic. That tends to happen with more general audiences. So you can use this um, audience identification to help work again about with that. And then we have the issue that Gen AI makes choices on what's important. You, as people who are involved in the decision-making process, you have to decide if you agree or not. Okay. And then lifecycle management. I think big issues here are using it to write or revise documentation. If there is code involved, ask it to write out comments and doc strings. Uh, and if you've uh, used generative programming, you know it often does a lot of things at once. Always ask for summaries changes before you accept them or before you commit them. Okay. So kind of going off my example, we'll start talking about using the practical aspects of using generative AI. So generative AI, again, if you've been looking at the press, is fairly successful at software engineering type projects. And the reason it is because it has a rich data set in the form of GitHub. In particular, the GitHub commits and the commit notes become a record of failures and how to fix them, which is not common in many domains. Usually, we don't like to talk about our failures in public. So GitHub happens to be an exception, which is why it works so well in programming. This same advantage doesn't translate to analytics. In analytics, all our projects in real life are very context dependent. I've never used a textbook example. Every company I've worked for has its own quirks and its own things that make it unique. Okay, and so those uniquenesses have to be in the model, and generative AI doesn't know that very well. The training data is heavy on statistics and machine learning. If that's what you're doing, wonderful. If you're doing something else, you need to supplement it. And so we are going to assume that generative AI is naive in the analytics models. It's going to require some guidance. That means expert review and direction, providing references, and teaching the generative AI how to do diagnostics. Okay. So fault lines, there are a few versions here. Uh, I tend to personify because the generative AI because this helps me talk with my business partners and stakeholders. So I categorize the fault lines in two forms, novice type errors and errors in naivete. So novice errors are the fact that novices and errors experts are very different. So experts think and do things very differently than novices. And the reason this is true is that in many fields, if you try to teach a beginner or a novice how to do things using expert terminology, you run into a language problem. The novices do not know the terminology. They do not know practices. They don't understand why. And so very often, novices are introduced one way, and then later on, they're taught the real way of doing things. Okay. So that's one issue. A second issue, and then again, the internet is full of guidance meant for novices. And so the novice level information overwhelms on the internet, overwhelms the expert level information. Second issue is that experts know how to ask about what they're not told. Novices and generative AI will give the best answer it can given the information it has. An expert, when they look at a problem, has frameworks they use, and they know that the information is given, what information they haven't been given, and how important is it. Okay. Next, we have naivete. Again, so one, facts are much more well documented than implications. Generative AI knows facts, not implications. Um, our training data doesn't always include failures. So, and even the Gen AI doesn't recognize its own failures. So sometimes you'll hear about churn and errors in generative AI, and that's where if there's three ways of trying something, it will often start cycling through, even though none of those three work, instead of trying new ones. Okay. So some practices. One is structured prompting. So if you ever hear about the terms prompt engineering, that's what we're talking about. There are many prompt engineering frameworks out there. At Highmark, we use one called Risen. Uh, they all work in different places, so you probably have to try one that works for your domain. And if your domain actually has a way of organizing information, that's actually a very good one to use, in particular because your stakeholders can understand it very well too. So I want to talk a little bit more about providing context. So one is we provide references, and so um, our models are usually implemented in computers, and so we usually have function references like APIs, and then usage examples. So these are methods textbooks, and I'll give you an example of that. You should give them a problem description, preferably one in the subject domain language, and then we can ask it for a mathematical formulation. And then you ask for an implemented model. So now notice that we now have three versions of the problem statement, and you can use the natural language problem statement is one your stakeholders can read, and you can check to make sure these three ask to work with each other. And then programming context. Context. If you have frameworks and libraries you want to use, you should use it. Enforcing separation concerns, you should be making the generative AI do basically one thing at a time. You're either doing math or software engineering. Okay. Probably a best def version of this, especially when you're working with stakeholders, is something called a product requirement document. So this is something that project managers and people with product owner job descriptions are very familiar with. And so this represents understanding of the SME and the end customer. Um, and let's say, this is our situation. Here's the background. Here's our context. This is what we need at the end. Uh, Another more computer version of this is something called an agents.markdown file. All the generative AI uh, models now recognize this. This is where you talk about all the computer related things. So what your application stack is, what frameworks you're using, what libraries, what kinds of models you're using. Um, the generative AI can also, you give it a process, what steps should it be using. So you're structuring the plan that the generative AI uses, and perhaps you'll have a current state. So you can explain what are we working on now, especially for something that goes over days. Okay. You can use the generative AI to make sure that the model is correctly implemented. Again, you now have three artifacts. Your problem statement that is from the um, understandable by the subject matter experts. You have a mathematical formulation, model implementation. You can um, compare them against each other. You can have the generative AI to compare them against each other and explain to you how they are actually the same. You can implement tests to make sure the implementation is correct. And you can write useful documentation. Again, we're looking at three places: the model implementation with commented source code, uh, and a commentary on how the mathematical formulation relates to the problem statement. So, an exercise that we in Informs Practice did over December, and this was online, was a 24-day of exercise that walked you through approval of product lifecycle. And so I did it. Most people using it were using it as a way of exercising optimization in a project. I was using it as a way of exercising generative AI. So the tools I was using, again, this is an optimization project, but I was going to use Visual Studio Code with the R extension because I was using R, a library. The generative AI, I was using it two ways. One is generative AI inside of Visual Studio. And so this happened to be Gemini Code Assist. And I also use something called a Notebook LM, which is a version of retrieval augmented generation. And I was using this for the simulation of working with stakeholders. And then I also had version control, which was something you do anytime you're using source code. For, again, context, the R libraries I was using was something called OMPR inside of R. So that's a standard optimization model. I had a textbook for optimization modeling using R. So I gave that to the generative AI um, in two formats. One, a PDF for the Notebook LM, and I also had the code files inside of my Visual Studio Code. We gave it the Informs Analytic framework. And then the Advent OR had a series of 24 messages to introduce a problem. And I was giving that to the generative AI as well. Okay. So we're looking at, again, the useful things here is interpreting the messages to technical terms and then output back to stakeholder terms. Worked with the data, recognized what the format, identified issues of cleaning it, and again, converting all that into R code that I could actually use. Work with formulation. Uh, we start with the very casual natural language that the problem gets stated in, create a formal natural language problem description, then a mathematical formulation, and from there to implemented code with comments. It would then create commented source code, and we would eventually run this and interpret it. Some notes here, and one is for anybody working with programming, is the programming a concept that you as the analyst have to enforce is going to be separation concerns. One real big reason to do this is on the internet, like GitHub, there is a lot more software engineering than there are data analysts of any kind. So the model wants to do software engineering tasks. Software engineers have lots of things they need to do to make something like one of our models be actually useful. Uh, but it is very separate from mathematical modeling and formulation and everything that we do with both with the mathematics and also are working with our design partners. So we usually want to focus completely there. The other issue is the generative AI, once it's decides that it's going to be a software engineer, it will try to do all the things that software engineers all at once, which is how if you hear press about doing thousands of lines of code, that's how it happens. And so you want to make sure that it doesn't do that. If it does, back it up, but keep it on math while you're doing math. Okay. So kind of like summarize, but I want to make sure I have time for questions. It can be a valuable aid. It's very useful if you, as an analyst, are working with a new subject domain, new methods, new tools. Um, it helps with translation, with understanding what the subject domain experts are telling you, and converting your output to the subject so the way that domain people understand it, and enabling that conversation. It can help create models from starting with an unstructured natural language question and translating into something more structured. But you have to be aware that there are going to be you should be looking out for certain kinds of mistakes and taking some measures to mitigate it. Okay, let's see. I guess Maria Anna can jump in here and check with questions.
Yes, we've got some good ones. Thank you so much for that. That was great. First one is reflecting on your path from Northwestern PhD through RAND and academia to industry. Was the PhD essential for your current work, or could alternative paths have been equally effective?
Okay, so this. Okay, so for people who are interested in PhD, the real question is why do you want to get a PhD? So there are some people who like it because they love the discovery, okay, of math and focusing on one deep question. Um, my work experience before I went to grad school, I was working with a retired Navy chief who was effectively the ex national expert on on what he was doing, and we were doing something transformative for our domain. And I decided then that I wanted to be able to do very novel things. And that's what a PhD does. A PhD does things where you don't know nobody knows how to do it. So you figure it out. And it happens to be in math if you're in operations research. And I do that here now. And when I tell people that when I'm at Highmark, I, um, on a fairly regular basis, I get a problem because nobody knows how to even approach it. And so that's kind of what the PhD did for me. Um, we can look at a problem that nobody even knows if there is a solution, much less how to get there. And so that's what the PhD was for. And that's very hard there might be another ways of doing it. The person I worked with had a 25-year career, and that's how he got there. The PhD is actually shorter. Uh, So, but yeah, no, I went to the PhD. For me, the PhD gave me creativity in looking at problems where nobody even knows how to approach. Okay,
Great.
yeah.
Thank you. All right, the next one. Based on your experience, how reliable have you found the results and recommendations generated by Gen AI? In what types of situations would you prefer to consult a human colleague rather than rely on Gen AI? And conversely, when do you find Gen AI to be the most effective resource?
Okay. So working with my business partners, so I work on projects where I'm eventually going to not be there every day. So one of the big things that my business partners work with use Gen AI for is they need an interpretation. And I've never, my whole career, I've always been a place where there aren't enough experts or there aren't enough high level experts around. So the generative AI can give a good first round interpretation on a data analysis. Um, so one real reason to use generative AI is the person is just not available, especially if you're trying to do interactive work, because it's hard to arrange for two or three people, experts, to be all together focused on one thing. It's a it's hard to make that kind of arrangement. And then on the other side, if you are the decision maker, and especially if you are outside facing and you are dealing with something in the moment, you can't just collect experts. So one of the things we definitely use generative AI for is when you really need an expert, you don't have one in the moment. Um, for things that are more longer term, it's really good for first cut on things. So like in programming, what a lot of us have noticed is that, especially for things that if I'm doing something I don't do very often, it will build skeletons for me. And so, for example, for math modeling, it's really nice, especially if it's a library I don't use very often, for it to lay out this is what the code has to do to make this work. The logic is very often wrong, but again, I'm an operations researcher. I'm good at logic, I hope. I'm good at math. I don't mind having to correct generative AI's math, but I'm very, very happy that it laid out my code for me. So I'm not trying to look up API or function references and things like that. So I use a lot for like skeletons. Um, my my business partners will use it as interpretation in lieu of an expert available. Um, and then people who are writers will often look at it as it will at least tell you what to look for or what are the key points, and they will go ahead and rewrite everything. But again, I do that too. So when in my own writing, my comment is it's wonderful for first draft. When I write first drafts, I mark it all up in red. I do the same thing with generative AI's drafts, but that first draft is hard, so I'm very happy to have it.
Yes,
Uh,
there's nothing scarier than a blank page.
right, and so the big one is the human goes last. That's kind of an important piece there.
Yes. Okay, here's another one. When we use Gen AI to help organize and clean data, usually we can't upload data directly to Gen AI platform in order to protect data confidentiality. In that case, how can we best use Gen AI to process data before analyses?
Okay. Um, so one thing is when I'm doing analysis, I'm usually doing it someplace else. Okay, so when we do the at the conference workshop, we're going to use a notebook, which is definitely a, a variation on the chat type interface. Um, you are if I'm actually doing analysis, I would like to kind of work in the platform as much as I can. So for example, data cleanup. So data cleanup, one is if you're running code, you can give it diagnostics. Okay, and so it's often the same in the if you're experienced, you could be able to look at the diagnostics and summaries to recognize you have a problem. Okay, so you can give that to the generative AI as well. Um, if you have errors in the code, uh, you can just work with code and errors and not your data. And so it will try to give you hints on that, very much like a person would have. Again, it's unnaturally, it's tends to be fairly good at coding because the people, especially if you're using open source, the libraries development is all in GitHub, and so the commits and the commit comments essentially are a record of things that can go wrong. So generative AI, actually, as far as programming is concerned, tends to have a actually good idea on what can go wrong, and so it will give you hints on what to look for. And so that might be how you do that in the case where, um, like, yeah, you don't have a generative AI that has a contract not to give up your data. Um, yeah, typically this is the advantage of the paid versions. The paid versions of most of these have provisions that they don't share under the paid version. Whereas if you look at your license agreements for the free versions, they tell you they're going to use it.
Absolutely.
But this is the argument for the paid versions.
Have you seen any job cuts for data scientists because of AI? For example, has your company reduced the budget for the data science team?
Um, so at this point, though, again, I'm in the health insurance. We have a severe cost problem. So we've never had enough data scientists. And then also and that is actually this is weird because I'm in health. We have manpower issues throughout, and that's kind of always been the case every time I've been there. So for us, the fact that AI is a productivity enhancer is important because um, every time that you've ever made a estimate of how many people you need, we've never had that level of people. So this might be, again, my whole career has been like that. I've always been in places where they had a shortage of trained people. Um, so at least at where we are, that hasn't been an issue. We're definitely in we need productivity enhancing because we're short as is.
Got it. All right,
Yeah.
here we have time for one last one. It seems like there's a need for experts in each field to create a list of gaps between what Gen AI can do and what expertise teaches you. Do you have any thoughts on if that's possible?
Uh, I usually work with my business partners, the subject matter experts there, and we end up writing one for every situation. It's almost impossible to have it long term because every context is very specific. That's actually one of the fun parts about working in industry. You're um, every company exists its own little niche and has uniqueness, and every situation you have has unique elements to it. So the guides have to be written there. It may not be possible to write a generic one. Um, Also, again, this idea of learning from failure is not something that most places. There's a few domains where I actually qualify as a subject matter expert. We don't like to air our dirty laundry in public. Um, so we probably won't have public guides that are very good. Um, but yes, I work with my business partners and we write interpretation guides for fit for purpose.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was a great presentation. And to all of you online, we hope to see you at the Analytics Conference in April. Thanks. Bye-bye.